Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's EDGEy conversation. Today, we're going to be in conversation with Jane Dawson, who works with the Eastern Ontario Outaouais Regional Council, primarily on clusters and networks. And so we're going to dive into this question of what is a cluster and network, and here are some examples, and just go back and forth a little bit. So I'm going to put myself on mute, and Jane, take it away.
Thanks, Alexandra, for that introduction, and glad to have the chance to be here talking about clusters and networks. So I thought that I would start just saying a little bit of background about what are clusters and networks. And in fact, I'll actually, because that's a big topic, I plan to focus more specifically on networks and what is the intention of networks, how they're a little bit different from each other, and then with two examples of networks that I've been involved with over the past year or so. And then to lift out from that, what are some examples of maybe what might animate networks, and where the challenges are. How do we actually do this kind of work within the United Church? So just to start off about what the heck are clusters and networks anyway. Just sort of the background are that this came out of the restructuring that happened in the United Church in 2019, with the idea that there are now these three levels of governance within the United Church. And then there are, and this is how they're described in the manual, that alongside that three council structure, there are clusters and networks, while not formal governance bodies, are central to living out the faith of the United Church. So kind of diving into that question, what do we mean by how are they central to living out the faith of the United Church? And with clusters, they're not very strongly defined in the manual intentionally, because I think that the idea was to give them enough definitional flexibility to take their own shape. But the idea behind a cluster being something that is a local group of communities of faith that provide community and support for things like mission and outreach and learning and collegiality. And then networks being intended to be more broad and geographically diverse, and ways of linking people working on specific issues. And that might be, and there might be some project work that comes out of that functions through the whole church. So the thing I think that's more specific about clusters, that they tend to have more of a local, bringing people together on a local level definition. And a lot of what's happening in my experience with networks is that tends to be a lot of where national and regional connections around the public witness and social justice work of the church is playing out. And so how are we living our faith through that form of activity? Networks is becoming one of the ways that that's happening. And so I think with the underlying intention about sort of why do we do this, with the idea that we can do more together than we can do alone. So what are the points of connection that help to build? I think I love the phrase that comes with EDGE, which is called a network, sort of reweaving the connectional fabric that makes us united. And so how do we be united in carrying out that kind of work? And so I think just because of COVID, the clusters conversation in my work has been backgrounded a little bit, that people are more involved in what they're doing in their community of faith. But there's been a big uptick in what's happening nationally and regionally around network work. So I'm going to concentrate particularly on the networks for this conversation, and describe two particular examples of networks that I've been working with particularly over the past year. So the first one that I will mention is, so this is a national network, which is the National Guaranteed Livable Income Network. And so that is around a policy initiative that emerged particularly as part of conversations from last spring, where with all of the things that have been happening with COVID and the COVID financial support, that there's a sense from the church and many other bodies beyond the church that it's time to come together around some form of policy for a guaranteed livable income for people who are living in marginal financial circumstances. And I don't need to go into the actual sort of focus of the network, because I really want to talk more about the function, because this is something, so it started out I was looking back in email last I think it was around a year ago this time, trying to figure out, well, how are we doing advocacy in a time of COVID? So Alexandra, maybe you were in on and even planning some of those early conversations a year ago about just getting people together. What are our issues? How do we do this? And so there was probably a dozen different topics that came forward out of national conversations of staff members and general council staff, or regional staff members, general council staff, and people from various communities of faith, both lay and clergy, involved in those conversations. So one of the issues was around guaranteed livable income. So I remember being in a conversation about a year ago, and there was maybe a half dozen people in an online conversation saying, yeah, we should be doing something around advocacy for this issue. And out of those conversations a year ago, in the summer, there was a little bit of more online discussion connecting people across the church, out of which came an idea in late August that, yeah, we should do this national campaign with a vigil or sort of a national, however many vigils there can be nationally. And with the idea that people, if you can't take part in a vigil in a pandemic, which is challenging, not necessarily having to go and stand out on the street holding a placard, but people who wanted to show their support could take a picture of a candle and send that to an MP or send that to the national office. And this is a way of showing support. And so in September, there were, I think, a total of 4 vigils and a number of people writing letters and taking pictures and posting them on the website and sending them to MPs. And so hearing some of the debrief from that network activity, that people were saying, well, that was actually the most show of action that there's been for any United Church campaign for some time. And then after that, then in April, I think it was April 8th, there was a follow-up vigil event, which turned out that there were 50 plus vigils that took place in front of churches, online, and in front of MPs' offices, and from Victoria to St. John's. And talking to some of the people who were involved in the planning and moving that forward, kind of saying, well, this was actually the most support for a United Church action than there has been in the past 10 years. So there was something about this issue that led to a kind of momentum that carried forward that the idea that really there is more that we could do together than we could do alone. And the idea of bringing people together across this national scope of joining together in these vigils and sending in sort of letters and posting things and writing things to MPs and to the Prime Minister. And so thinking about that is that a success story for a network? I don't think all networks have to be intentional around an advocacy campaign, but just thinking about what was it that got the momentum going for that action to build to the level that it did, and identifying for me some of the key things that came out of that was that there really was a sense of coming together and having a specific focus, that we have a thing to do and a plan to carry that action forward. And that there is a way of levels of involvement from general council staff to regional council staff to people, sort of a lot of lay involvement, a lot of clergy involvement, that it really did include people across all levels of the church. And so really thinking about that as its way of including people but keeping its grassroots focus, because there's out of that developed working groups in each of the 16 regional councils to be carrying forward plans for next steps. So with a little bit of general council support, so it's not led by a staff member, but it's supported by a staff member. So there's been a lot of work that's happened in trying to work out all of those kinds of relationships around how to bring work together and how to support it. And there's a few other things I might say about that, about the effectiveness of that particular way that a network has worked. But because I know that you were a part of those conversations, Alexandra, I might ask you to turn your mic back on and see in being on either in the part of or on the edge of that development of a network, do you have any thoughts or questions that come out of that experience that I've just described?
Yeah, I'm intrigued as to who stepped up as leaders within the network itself that were not staff. And then I know that Lori Neal was a big convener or connection point of those different folks at the General Counsel office. So I'm interested in kind of how those leadership roles were shared. And how the coordination or support kind of was lived out in this particular example.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think that there was maybe some stick handling around that at the beginning, because Lori Neal, as the General Counsel staff member, was the center point. And so I think at the beginning it was like, oh, Lori's kind of leading the charge on this. This is her network, and she did a good job of saying, no, I can support people I can be the connector. I can do some helping of sending out emails and organizing meetings, but the momentum really has to come from other places. And I think in that particular example, two things that I think are strengths of that network was, first of all, one of the big champions was and continues to be Lois Wilson, a former moderator, who just has a huge passion for the topic and is positioned within the United Church. She has passion, and she has a voice, and she has a former title that carries a lot of momentum with her. And then there was a few other people. So another person is Barry Morris, who's involved in a community ministry called the Longhouse in Vancouver, and again being a passionate advocate for the work. And so so the two of them working together with, I think there was also Susan Eagle in Ontario in Shining Waters Regional Council, has been involved with advocacy work for people in poverty for a long time. So it was kind of this combination of three people in different locations who brought that momentum together. And in fact, sometimes I felt bothered by them. I thought, okay, give me a break. But just noticing how much that kind of passionate grassroots leadership carries the momentum. And so having people in different positions who come together. So that was one thing that was really important with that issue. And then also, it is something that has current momentum now because it's timely, but it also grows out of something that has been something that the United Church has come together around. Just in looking at documentation, it's since 1972 that the United Church has been standing up and speaking out on, well, we need to have some kind of support for a policy to support people more broadly than what we have with the piecemeal forms of funding. So it has forms of a track record carried by the passion of people at the grassroots level.
I think it's also a great example of showing how network theory kinds of comes to play. Mm-hmm. So in the development of a network, a lot of them start as what's considered this hub and spoke model, where you have like a central person who is the connection point for everybody else. And then as that kind of, we can see that happened at the very beginning with Lori convening a conversation. Right. And then the next part was you develop nodes. So other people who are also kind of a hub and spoke, but in different places. So that's the example of the three folks that you mentioned in different parts of the country whose names are escaping me. Right. And so like that kind of decentralizes this concrete center point a little bit, because now that is held more by the other nodes. And then as it continues to grow, those nodes like will multiply a little bit more, and then will connect to each other as well. And that central person like no longer has to be that strength, because now they can speak to each other. And so that's a really interesting way of kind of looking at the way in which regional and general counsel staff can participate. We can say, okay, the power of my relationships right now is that I have these connections and we can convene this conversation. and start it and see how it's going and help that momentum kind of catch its ignition, like be that domino that helps to make other things fall. But then that, there is a natural point at which that kind of shifts gears into these other folks. And I think that that's a really, it usually happens over a longer period of time. I think that it's wonderful that in the GLI case, because of the fact that it is so timely and there's a lot of momentum and it touches on everybody's life, like in a very direct and visceral way right now. So like all of those things allowed for this sort of development of a network that is functionally stable now because of the fact that it doesn't have a center point. It has these other points, so it can keep moving and waxing and waning kind of in its own way, and doesn't rely on this center point to be the thing that kind of keeps it going.
Exactly. Well, and I think that that's a really good way to define how networks are intended to work, and this being, to my mind, a really good example, as you say, of how this is lived out, because there is, if it stays just coming from the center, then the center is going to burn out. And so part of the next step with this particular network is to really build up the nodes. So I think at this point, there is now a working group within each of the 16 regional councils. And so then the work is carried in each regional council of that working group coming together to figure out, okay, what are we going to do within our region next out of this? And so then all of that momentum is a little bit more local, with one added thing that I think is a really good demonstration in this example of I think strengths of when networks can come together is kind of keeping the focus specific. And so around the planning, sort of, we're going to do a vigil. We know why we're going to do a vigil. This is a piece of advocacy. But then what are the next stages of work? It's going to be focusing on education, because I think as say, going back to Lois, who's a real champion, she says, isn't it great that 50 plus vigils happen representing maybe 60 or 70 different congregations? That's still a drop in the bucket in terms of the total number of United Church congregations. So how do we then, through intentional relationship building, she's not big on, say, Twitter campaigns or anything that is sort of using simply social media. It's how do you build a relationship with people that you know? And she's a real advocate for picking up the phone and phoning somebody in the community of faith down the road from you and saying, what, nobody was there. Might there be anybody in your congregation who might be interested to show up for the next conversation? And so this idea of grassroots recruitment, of sort of one conversation at a time, but really using conversations as a way to build connection. And that if you send an email, that's easy to skim over. If you phone a friend and not necessarily twist their arm, but share your passion, then that might be something that builds that momentum, that continues to build the momentum. And so recruitment being a big issue, and then education is kind of the next platform that particular network is working on, because for as many people in the United Church who support that issue, there's a lot of people who I think have very good arguments and questions about guaranteed livable income, about, well, is that workable? They have some worries and suspicions about it. And so how do we create now opportunities for conversation for people who have doubts and questions to also be invited to enter into that conversation? So kind of having that sense of a focus of what the intention of the network is to keep carrying the work forward. So that's the example of, as you said, Alexandra, a network that kind of took off for that piece of action and was able to achieve something for the United Church, was fairly big and visible in a short period of time. So then I want to say a little bit about another network that I've been involved with, which is happening at the regional council level. It is a network within Eastern Ontario Outaouais Regional Council around the issue of affordable housing. And I would say that where this network is far more typical of where I am with lots of other networks. It's still really trying to find its its shape and its purpose and its raison d'etre. So there are probably a handful so far. There's about 5 people from maybe 3 different communities of faith coming together who have an interest in issues of affordable housing. And so they say, well, wouldn't it be great to have a network, a region-wide network, to be a place where we can share resources and information and come together and share stories around the region about what sorts of affordable housing issues that we're dealing with, which can be very different from place to place. So Eastern Ontario, Outaouais has as its center Ottawa, and so there would be some issues of affordable housing and homelessness, say in inner city areas of Ottawa, compared to some of the more rural parts of the region, where there might be less visible housing problems, but very real housing problems. So there might be issues of people who are, I think one of the things that gets mentioned a lot is people who are seniors living in homes where there's no transit, they can't drive anymore, there just aren't the sources of support, and there aren't necessarily places for them to go to follow the invitation to age in place. If they're going to age anywhere, they have to move out, and there aren't necessarily seniors facilities in the locations that they have their sense of place and presence and home. And then there is another kind of branch of the affordable housing conversation is around congregations that might be trying to think about decisions about what to do with their church building, if they're doing some purposing of the building. A lot of people involved in that process are interested in thinking about, might there be some things that we can do with our church around supporting affordable housing building. So it's a very diverse topic, which I think is a strength of it, but also part of the reason why it's having just taking some time to find its sense. Well, what do we do as a network? How do we come together? And so one of the steps of the people in the planning process, well, why don't we send out a survey to the mailing list for people who receive the regional council newsletter, and just ask a set of questions to get people to, or ask people to identify what are the affordable housing issues in your area. And so I worked with that group on a couple of iterations of developing a survey to send out. And that just didn't go anywhere, because it turned out that the issues were too diffuse. So they decided, well, we're not going to do a survey, because when you send out a survey, you don't necessarily get a lot of answers anyway, and that people who do answer surveys often have survey fatigue. So let's do a series of interviews. So they have been learning a lot about what different people in different parts of the region are identifying as their affordable housing issues, say in a rural area, in a small town, in an inner city Ottawa area. So they're gaining a lot of rich detail of stories. But now their question is, what do we do next? How do we go forward? What do we do with these stories? And so they're very much at a formation stage of trying to figure out those questions for themselves. And again, trying to figure out who does the work of this? How do we attract more people to the conversation? And primarily, I think that there has been one person who is kind of leading the charge, with me coming in being the regional support person. But how does it move from a hub to a spoke? It's sort of not worked out that form of traction yet, and it would never be looking for the kind of national scope that the Guaranteed Livable Income network was intending to build. But so the next thing that they're planning to do is just to carry the conversation forward, just a series of 4 online conversations open to people in the region, with people who can speak from a position of knowledge or expertise around their perspective on affordable housing issues. And so there might be a researcher at the University of Ottawa who's available, or Tim Blair, who is the CEO of I always forget what the acronym is, of the Property Redevelopment, UPRC, is it?
Yes, United Property Redevelopment Corporation.
Right. So again, if he might be available, he's done this with our region before, but to talk again, what is that? What can we do to help your church redevelop its property, particularly if affordable housing becomes something that they want to be able to support, and a few other people speaking about different housing issues. And that would be a way to attract people to those conversations and build connectivity, just keeping in touch with whoever shows up. But that's going to be a long, slow, much slower process of just putting it out there of this is something that we as the United Church support in terms of what is it that, how are we living out our faith? How are our commitments to an understanding of housing as a key issue, and how everybody has a right to housing? How do we support that and do some network building about that? So those people, just to bring that into an example of a network that I think the folks in that network sometimes come together and say, well, we're not working to an exact formula, and this feels kind of slow and frustrating. So I think sometimes there's a sense, well, are we getting anywhere? And I sort of feel like I'm sort of a cheerleader and champion and saying, well, sometimes you're only getting somewhere one conversation at a time, but the fact that these conversations are happening and that even among themselves, they're kind of coming away with a sense, you know, I just had no idea about the types of housing issues that are happening around the region, because people tend to be so localized. So we might know in Ottawa, here are the housing issues here, but just to think about, well, what about in some of the smaller communities? What are their experiences like, and how can we learn from each other? What can we gain from hearing each other's experiences? And I think just seeing the value in that. So I think I'm going to stop there and just ask you, Alexandra, if you have any, just in terms of your own experience, because I know it's been a part of your job to be supporting networks and clusters, if you have any thoughts for that group about what they might do next, or any experiences that come to mind from what you've heard about networks over the past time that has been a part of the United Church conversation that you think would be helpful to add to what we've been talking about here.
Yeah, well, it's definitely interesting seeing these two different networks kind of in contrast to each other. The one that has started with an event that drove the momentum and now is diving more into the education and awareness side of their work. And then this network that you're talking about in relation to affordable housing, it still is very timely, it still is very important and connects to everyone's life, because everyone should have a shelter to be able to be in, and is starting more from this awareness and education side of things. And so we'll slowly kind of like, they work at a different pace because of the fact that you have, you're starting in these different places. I think that in terms of the affordable housing group, starting with these 4 conversations around education and awareness definitely will help to provide the scope for others to say, okay, well, maybe the nodes that we develop are these, you know, we'll have this urban node, a small town node, a small town or rural node, and then like an aging in place node, or something like that. And they'll kind of develop around these topical pieces, as opposed to developing particularly around, I know that it's kind of location based, but not location based in the same way as having, like, you know, a regional node, right, for each thing. And then like those nodes will come together and flesh out the issue, but then also have their own momentum and speed and kind of advocacy places that they could act in. For example, let's say like with a church that's considering affordable housing as a redevelopment option. Well, we have the United Church Property Corporation, and so if there's something like a piece of integrity that we believe with our faith that we need to live into, that we don't necessarily see fully expressed or understood or something like that, then like there is a direct connection point. You know, like we can say, okay, well, now we need to talk with UPRC and say, you know, we're noticing this particular thing. How are we going to respond to it? Using our like theological grounding, and also being an example. I think the fact that UPRC exists is also an example of that sort of response to advocacy, that like there needs to be a space that is not driven by the market to allow for nonprofit and charitable building work. And so there's like kind of a leaning place that can happen there. Whereas like if you have another node that's focused on housing and homelessness in downtown Ottawa, or in, you know, in places where homelessness is more visible, then maybe that node starts to connect with other social services in the area and can act as like an educator and a place that's where you have those connections to those other places. So if someone is coming and you notice them, then you can share that information with all of the churches and say, okay, well, here are the services that are available that are near you and worthwhile to develop a relationship with, so that you can help them. And a lot of like ministers hold a lot of that information, but that's also, you know, within the folks that are on site, for example, who end up seeing people from those populations come into the church to talk. So there are different like potential opportunities for advocacy within all of these spaces. And then there's also joint ones. Like, let's say all of these nodes kind of start to develop independently, and then there's an opportunity at some point to say, okay, they're in Ottawa, the strategic plan that they're doing for the city is this. We will now have like an opportunity to advocate for all of these different aspects of related to affordable housing in this strategic planning process. And so like now we can come together and advocate together in this particular way. So it's really interesting that like sometimes it's seeding folks with those ideas of like how their network can be impactful down the road, and that like where they are is okay, is helpful. I know that I've been a part of a seniors advocacy network, mostly looking at long-term care facilities and, you know, essential visitors as a concept, and like the fact that many not spiritual directors, chaplains have been denied access to long-term care facilities throughout like the pandemic. And, you know, not having that and not having access to, you know, their people, a lot of like folks who, you know, are just, there's a real problem there. And so we had a group and we had momentum and we were thinking about this, but we didn't really identify how we could use our time together in a way that was helpful. Like we would gather and kind of commiserate about things that we had encountered in our various areas, but then hadn't really fully defined that next thing. And then there was a conversation that was happening regionally, and they invited like others who were working on this nationally to join in. And then that network had the momentum to be able to continue to pull it along. So sometimes it's always also like a relinquishment of control and saying, okay, the lifespan of this particular set of people in this group is no longer kind of working. You know, there's something that's kind of, there's something there that's very faithfully there and very important. And yet as a group, we haven't been able to figure out a next step. So then there was this opportunity where our next step could kind of like come in, and we were able to join that and find a renewed sense of energy. So I think there's also potential around, you know, coming back to this idea of how we as general counsel and regional staff can play a part, is just having an awareness of what's happening in other regions or in other parts of the country, especially now that borders seem to, well, borders, I don't want to use such a heated term, but like, you know, our physical location is not quite as important because we use Zoom as a way of communicating. And our physical location is important in terms of particular types of advocacy or things that we are focusing on. But there's an opportunity, let's say like, someone from Saskatchewan wants to learn about affordable housing, and, would they be able to sit in on like one of these 4 conversations and hear what's happening somewhere else, and then be able to bring that back and say, okay, well, I have some more knowledge and I have a little bit of personal momentum now. Maybe I can be a hub for my area and figure out how we can address this question here. So there, like that sort of cross-pollination is really a space that I feel that we can lean into as well and say, okay, I've had a conversation with person A and that connects to network B over here. So like, let's connect that and not be quite as stiff, I guess, about like where people are located or what backgrounds they come from, but then also holding on to that at the same time, if that makes sense.
That kind of attention, exactly. And I think that one of the things that my experience has been, and I'm sort of hearing some of that in what you're saying, is kind of going back to that intention around networks to be sort of as a way of living out the faith of the United Church, and that sense of how are these ways of connecting around issues inviting us to go deeper into our faith and reach wider outside of the work that we're doing in our congregation, just to be connecting with other congregations, with other denominations, with other community neighbors. And really, I think holding that connectivity to be a really key aspect in and of itself of how we're living out our faith. And there isn't necessarily a map. And I think, as you say, to kind of sometimes relinquish the sense, because I think that we tend to, I find I do anyway, tend to like to think that we've got a plan, we're working towards the plan, and it's the outcome of the plan that we're working to achieve, which sometimes things do happen that way, but sometimes it's just this person happens to hear about this person who happens to hear about that person. And then, as you say, hey, there's this person in Saskatchewan who has a particular interest or issue or knowledge about affordable housing and can take part in an online conversation. So that sense that gets built about how we are living our faith in this wider work that we're doing and building these forms of connectivity that are, I think I've never been in as many conversations with as many people. I mean, partly Zoom and moving into this Zoom reality helps. And partly, I don't ever want to thank COVID for anything, but in fact, because of that being a necessity, it's bumped forward a movement, I think, that was already starting to happen. But just to be a part of conversations within the regional council, that somebody in Ottawa is in a conversation with somebody from Pembroke, who's in a conversation with somebody from Merrickville and somebody from Rockville, and they say, hey, who knew that you were here? And just hearing their stories about talking about the different features of their church buildings and the location of their church buildings and the kinds of things that they're doing in their communities. And so those are kind of the informal things that might come out of networking work that doesn't tick a box. And I think that of sort of tick an outcome box, but I think it really builds a sense of being a part of a united church in new and for me, exciting ways.
Absolutely. And
yeah.
I think that it really, this sort of momentum around building networks or having networks as a place for us to live out our faithfulness and our spiritual selves is really unique. You know, like if I go to church, I get a particular type of community and relationship that I hold very dear. And that's a part of my faith and a part of the way that I live out my faith. And there are also other parts of the way that I live out my faith or other things that I want to do. And what this is doing is kind of disrupting this idea that the minister or the folks who are in leadership within a community of faith are the ones that hold the position to be able to participate in these other conversations. And it's kind of disrupting that and saying, no, anybody can participate in these conversations. And it's allowing people to, you know, like really recognize in themselves what is their gift and what is the role that they play within their community of faith. And for many, it can be just a, you know, I want to be here. And then for others, you know, it's working with ministries that you work with within the community of faith that are kind of more defined, formalized things, like with a food bank or other community ministries nearby. And then there's this new step that feels like, you know, you don't have to represent your community of faith. You don't have to, like, you know,
you can be you.
To hold on to these other identities. You're just yourself coming to participate in the work of God in a new kind of, in a different way, that allows for your own gifts to really be emphasized in a new way as well. So I think that this is this movement toward networks has an opportunity to show people just how magnificent, you know, they are, and that everybody has a gift that can be shared as well. And so there's something, like, I haven't found a perfect way to articulate it yet, but there's something around that sort of kind of disruption and being really present to how you participate in society and what you're advocating for, and how you can bring your faithfulness into that in a new way. So.
Yeah, well, and I think that as I listen to you, just really recognizing the strengths of what people gain out of being a part of their community of faith, and then there's kind of this other way of being present to the wider church. And so I always think of it as both and that we get to have that strength. But often I think in the and part, and I think about times that I might have been involved in a congregation, because I've sort of moved around a lot, and I think, well, I've got a passion for this issue, but none of these people here really are excited about this in the same way that I am. So then there can be that thought, well, I guess it's not that interesting, or I guess I don't really have that much to offer about this. But that thought that, so it's a real way of recognizing the passion and kind of lifting people's passion forward, and that there can be a way that your community of faith supports you in some ways, and then you have a passion that, oh, hey, I can be in this conversation beyond that, and find other people who share that passion. So it may not be local, but just looking around and sort of saying, hey, they're out there, and what can we do by finding each other and having these sorts of wider conversations.
Exactly. And I think that this is a really wonderful place for us to kind of wrap up our conversation for the day. But it has been wonderful, as usual, talking with you, Jane. And thank you very much for sharing your experiences of networks. And I hope that those who are listening in have felt a little bit of fire ignite in themselves, and just see what the possibility is for connecting with others and being a presence in your community. So thank you very much, Jane.
Well, thanks for this opportunity, Alexandra. It's I always, every time I talk about networks and every time I talk with you, I come away feeling more affirmed in the importance of this work in the church. So thanks for the invitation.
Thanks. Hi, folks. Thank you for watching this episode of EDGEy Conversations. If you would like to be in touch with anyone featured on this video, please comment below or email edge@united-church.ca. New content comes out every Monday, so be sure to like and subscribe to catch more videos like this one. Have a great week.